So now I'm turning to Part B of your actual AP exam and the second part of your Unit 2 exam. We are not hitting you with 85 questions. You'll just have 37 and 20 minutes to complete them. I've already covered some of the topics that will come up, such as the stele of Hammurabi and date. So let's move on to some multiple choice questions that did not get covered in the first podcast. This shows up in a number of questions, many of them actual AP questions. And by the way, this is not an ideal photograph, but you should all recognize the step pyramid. Not all the questions on this exam, by the way, come from past AP tests, but I have an AP next to the ones that do so that you can get a feeling about what the College Board will throw at you. Your semester exam, by the way, will consist only of AP questions on subjects you studied so far. So the good news is that on your semester exam, you will have seen all the multiple choice questions, and the bad news is that there will be lots of questions, including some short answer essay questions that you haven't had on previous tests. So what is this building? Actually, I already told you. What function did it serve? Why is it so important in architectural history? And this is a big hint, who designed it? Do you remember that from the video? But here's a tough one. I did talk about this, and it was in your, or actually it was in your PowerPoints, and it was in your study guide as well. The architect, whose name you should know, included columns in this complex. They don't show up in this picture at all clearly. They do show up more clearly on the picture that the College Board had, but I couldn't seem to find it. Now, this architect had not entirely figured out columns. He did not realize that standalone columns could, in fact, support the weight of a roof. So he used blank columns. This is a vocabulary term you need to know for this exam. The video talked about this, and it's on the PowerPoints as well and in your study guides. Note, the College Board expects you to know a lot of architectural terms. There's another question, which is also image-based, that asks about a style that involves rows of columns with relatively little internal open space. It's a common feature of Egyptian temples. It's a term you've gotten and that you'll need to know, as well as an image you'll need to recognize. So check out page 75 of your textbook if you're not sure what I'm talking about. Oops. Now, this is actually another subject I'm going to need to add next year. In fact, I plan to add it to the architecture PowerPoint today if you're going to be reviewing those. This is a pylon temple, which was not a mortuary temple. It was a temple to the gods. You've probably heard the term pylon applied to bridges. They're those huge support structures that a bridge is attached to. Well, those tall, sloping, hint, hint, towers are pylons. Check this out on page 74 in your book. This is something I clearly should have covered in more detail. This also, oops. Sorry, I went by too quickly. This also I did not include in my lecture slides since it's all text without images. But wouldn't you know, it turned up as an AP question. This is the Rosetta Stone, which had the same inscription in 3 languages, one of which was hieroglyphic Egyptian and one of which was ancient Greek. Since scholars knew Greek, this proved the key they needed to decipher hieroglyphics. My guess is that you learned all about this in ancient Civ, but here it is again. I'm just giving you a freebie here. Okay, now we move on to these images. There are actually several questions about this image. They come from the textbook, not past AP tests, but they're very similar to AP questions. And actually, as I recall, I think there are a couple of actual AP questions on this very famous work. And it's quite likely to show up on your College Board exam in May. And you recognize this, right? So study the images. Here are some questions to think about. How is the king represented? Not only directly, but how is he represented symbolically? What are stand-ins for the king? How are his enemies portrayed? How are his victories portrayed? What event does this commemorate? What stylistic conventions does the artist use? And why is this artifact so important to historians, including art historians? In other words, go back and review this one. It's important. Okay, there are several questions, some of them actual AP questions, about relief sculpture in the ancient Near East, with particular reference to the Assyrian reliefs. Remember the video you saw on the hunting reliefs in the Assyrian palace of Ashurbanipal? So here are some of these reliefs. Not only do we have a relief from that palace, that's at the bottom, but you also see the victory stele of Naram Sin, the palette, and another one that did not appear on your exam, but I happen to have, and it was just a good illustration of relief techniques. So, some questions to think about. What devices are used to show narrative? What devices are used to show the relative importance of individuals? How are these sculptured produced? In other words, you need to know the two kinds of relief sculpture, one that's raised up and one that's dug into the stone. Note that you've also learned a metal relief turn in the earlier in the introductory chapter. We're going to return to that. You will see some of that. The bottom relief is Assyrian. What are the characteristics of Assyrian relief sculpture? And by that I mean not only how are they made, but what are the most typical subjects covered in Assyrian relief sculpture? And what function do they serve? What message are they intended to deliver? Now we're going to get to a series of fairly straightforward questions. So, what's this? What work is represented here? Where is it originally located? What artwork is this? This is an example of, I'm not looking here, by the way, for a specific identification. We've already talked about this work in my earlier podcast, but a category of artwork. What is this kind of pillar known as? You're going to encounter this term again in the next unit and also when we look at Mayan art, and it was one of your vocabulary words, and it's something that the AP question is going to ask you to know. In other words, it's a previous AP question. Okay, you saw this for your short essay. This is a different kind of question, which is God identification. Not all of these are going to be on the test, but one of them will. So, who's the god with the jackal's head? Who's the god with the hawk head? And who is the god sitting on the throne with a tall white hat? Again, you'll need to know one of these. What's this? What function did it serve? By the way, this I think showed up on a couple of the AP exams I have. So if you get a couple of questions about it, that's because I throw in pretty much all of the questions that I have. Obviously, the College Board thinks these are cool too. You should know them. You're going to need to know one of these names and functions. These are Chinese bronze vessels. They're two different kinds of vessels with different Chinese names. The question actually isn't going to ask you an image. It's going to ask you to identify it by function. By the way, this was not an AP question, but I do not want to entirely ignore Chapter 7. But remember that one of the major purposes of the last images, the last artworks we looked at from China, Japan, and Africa was to give you some possible examples to use in future cross-cultural essays, including the one that's going to be due on Friday. So similarly, what kind of African images were these and what were their functions? One of these is going to appear on the test. You need to know their names and functions. This, again, is not an AP question, but I don't want to ignore this chapter either, and I want you to keep these figures in mind for possible use in a future essay. Okay, believe it or not, this was an AP question. Whose army was this and what else did he build? By the way, knowing the dynasty is really good enough, but as I said, this was an actual AP question, the only one I saw in the early Chinese or Japanese art. What's this and what is it made of? For that matter, what are most Mesopotamian structures made of and why? And then also, what function did this structure serve? Talked about this a lot on my last podcast. You guys should have this one down. Okay, what are the characteristic stylistic features of this culture's art as exhibited by these works? By the way, these images themselves won't be on the test. Instead, you're going to get a descriptive question. But these could very easily show up on the AP test because, frankly, these are famous figures. Okay, you all know this one, right? What is the subject, or rather subjects, of this famous work? These won't show up on your AP exam probably, but again, I don't want to ignore chapter 1 entirely. So what era do these works represent, and what artistic convention does the art on the right show? Remember, you want to pay attention to how people are portrayed in ancient Near Eastern art and how animals are portrayed, not only in this era of art, but also in later Near Eastern art. Okay, what's this? And where does it come from? This is another one of those works that I want you to have in your toolkit for future essay tests. Okay, what is the difference between additive and subtractive sculpture? And I've got an example of each. On the left is a B disc, and on the right is something I just asked you to be able to identify. Just remember, if you can carve it, it's subtractive. So if it's made of stone or wood, it's going to be a subtractive sculpture. If you build up material or mold it, or so clay or bronze, then it's additive. These are terms that the AP exam may very well include and that you need to know. Okay, here was another AP question that caught me slightly by surprise. I mean, we went over this. It was in your reading. We talked about it briefly, but I'm not sure I made specific reference. So this is one of the most famous moments in archaeological history. In 1923, Howard Carter opened this previously unopened, undiscovered tomb, really the only unopened tomb that archaeologists have found, and it yielded amazing treasures, even though this wasn't a particularly major pharaoh. And you should all know this one by now, but again, I don't want you to encounter any surprises on your first unit test. Good luck. I hope you all do great. You should be, if you study and follow the clue trail that I've given you, you should all get perfect scores, or at least very good scores.